Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So today we've got one for all the folks here that are using Ubiquiti Unifi network equipment. And I'm going to discuss an issue that I found with the Unifi Zone Based Firewall. So the Unifi Zone Based Firewall, which I'll refer to from now on as ZBF, is in my opinion poorly designed. So don't throw rocks. We're going to get into the details here in just a minute. So ZBF policies in the same zone don't work because networks in the same zone already have access. And when you convert to the zone-based firewall, you end up getting all of your networks and VLANs being tossed into what they call the internal zone. And ZBF policies that cross zones are often ignored due to IP tables chains that get evaluated and they drop the traffic before the ZBF policies are ever examined. And this happens once you restrict traffic between zones and you try to add exceptions to those restrictions. So existing IP tables chains, things like uBIOS underbar forward underbar jump and uBIOS underbar pre-routing underbar jump, are UDM system chains that always get evaluated before the ZBF zone rules. And so we also have some legacy issues with the old IDS and IPS. And ZBF takes over the role of IDS or IPS. And if you've looked carefully in the GUI, the new GUI, you've not noticed anything for threat management adjustment of IDS, IPS, because the zone-based firewall is supposed to take care of that issue. And so if the legacy IDS, IPS settings are still enabled, packets are still processed for threat management, and they also seem to be another place where ZBF policies are broken. And so existing IP tables chains do break ZBF policies, and that's really the focus of what I'm trying to say. So zone-based rules only handle cross-zone traffic. If the traffic is originating from a DMZ subnet behind a VLAN or virtual interface, sometimes the traffic hits the zone policy because it's caught, or it never hits the zone policy because it's caught in a system chain first. And we're going to demonstrate that because I can create a policy which should be doing a permit, but that policy won't actually work. And so, in fact, I've never gotten this to work once I upgraded to the zone-based firewall, but I actually believe that this breakage exists before that. So how exactly can we fix that? Well, the first thing is you can wait for Ubiquiti to fix this, or there might be some other solutions, although probably not quite as eloquent. So you can just open all your VLAN traffic, which is the current default. That is that when you create a new VLAN, by default, all VLANs can communicate with other VLANs. So if you have VLANs already created, say for your IoT network, but you don't restrict their access back to your main LAN, or you don't have any exceptions where you have to have communication from your IoT LAN back to your main LAN after you've restricted most of the access, then you probably won't ever run into this issue. So I came up with the idea of creating a custom script to allow your specific traffic that you're looking for, since no matter what I did with ZBF policies, I could never get there. So this will allow the traffic, since an allow rule in ZBF is being ignored if there is a block rule on that particular VLAN. And this problem is likely related to either incremental upgrades or just upgrades to Unifi OS over recent years. I'm kind of led to believe that if you're installing a new Unifi Cloud Firewall that you might not experience this problem, but I think you'll experience it if you have upgraded over the years, and particularly if you've upgraded to the zone-based firewall. So let's take a look at how to address this problem. I first encountered this problem with my Mesh Central, and after having created my Mesh Central and added some clients that were not on the main LAN, I started to see this communication issue. So this Pi-hole IoT is an example of one that is completely open at the moment because I'm still trying to fix the problem, and you can see that we are able to connect to it with the terminal. But if I go back up here and I look at my Rocket Chat, which is in my DMZ network for my hosted applications, it does show up here, as you'll notice, as being bolded, and it can see the agent, which means that from the main LAN where the Mesh Central is located, it's able to contact the VLAN for the DMZ where Rocket Chat is located. But if I click on the Rocket Chat, go over to terminal and try to connect, it will never actually connect to that Rocket Chat instance. And all it needs in order to do so is port 443. And as we'll see shortly, that does not work if you create a rule for that in the zone-based firewall. Here's my Ubiquiti UDM Pro, and you'll notice that I'm running Unifi OS version 4.3.6 as of October 11th, 2025, and network version 9.5.21. So if I go over here to the gear and I click on the zones selection, you can see that I have converted to the zone-based firewall. In the zone-based firewall, you'll see that my main LAN, which is Scott and Kat's LAN, is in here, as well as my IoT LAN, which is ATF Corral, and then ATF DMZ is another, and then LabNet is another, and NordVPN. So all these others are, in fact, VLANs. The external zone is going to be the primary and backup WAN interfaces, as well as any VPN clients that you have here. And I don't have anything in my gateway group, and that's because it is a zone which is allowed to access all other zones by default. And then we have the VPN zone, and that has my various VPNs. My hotspot zone has my guest hotspot, and then I moved my cloud DMZ, which is where I host all of my WAN accessible applications, things like the Rocket Chat server, the discussion.scotti-BYTE.com, the website, and so on. And so the reason I moved it to this DMZ zone is because that way it wouldn't be part of the internal zone. So the Rocket Chat server is sitting down in the DMZ zone, and up in the internal zone is where I have my main LAN, and that is where my Mesh Central and also my Nginx proxy manager are located. The zone matrix is a really valuable tool to be able to see which particular policies apply to which zones and where they connect. So right now I have all policies highlighted, and if I scroll down, I have quite a few different rules. So one of the things that I kind of disagree with is when I converted to the zone-based firewall, Ubiquiti decides to create basically 4 policies for every one firewall rule I had previously. And the reason for this is because if you just look at this allow anything to habitat rule, you'll notice that I have one for the destination zone being hotspot, one for the destination zone being external, one for the destination zone of VPN, and one for the destination zone being internal, which is where the habitat is to begin with. And so I argue that all I really need here is that fourth rule, but part of the ZBF conversion was to create all those other esoteric rules. And I suppose the reason for that was to not break anything. Let's go look at the specific zone-based firewall rules I have right now. And if I scroll up in this list and I click on allow return here at the intersection between the source being the DMZ zone and the destination being the internal zone, you can see that I have created an allow DMZ cloud to NPM policy. And this policy says that cloud DMZ network, which is the only network in that DMZ zone currently, is the selected network. And then I have the HTTPS port set, which is port 443. And the action is to allow and also to auto allow the return traffic. The destination zone is the internal zone because that is where my main LAN is, and that is where my Nginx proxy manager is located. And then I specifically have the address of 172.16.0.15, which is the address of my Nginx proxy manager. And I also specify that the port is going to be port 443 down here. So you would assume at this point in time that that particular zone-based firewall policy would allow connection from my Mesh Central to any Mesh Central client that is on the DMZ network. We can test this by going back to Mesh Central, and you notice here that the Rocket Chat is lit up, and that simply means that my Rocket Chat instance can be seen from my Mesh Central. But we want to make sure that communication from the Rocket Chat instance can make it back to Mesh Central. So I'm going to click on this. I'm going to go over to terminal, and I'm going to tell it to connect to the terminal. And in virtue of the zone-based firewall rule that we just examined, it'll allow it to connect. And in fact, it does not. Here I am in an SSH session in my UDM Pro, and I'm going to use the VI editor to edit the script file that I created. Be sure to read the show notes to see all the specifics on how to set this up. But in summary, basically what I have here is the concept of allowing my DMZ network, and that means that anything that is on my 80 VLAN, and that includes my Rocket Chat, will be able to make an internal SSH connection. And when I was debugging this, I said SSH or HTTPS. I don't really mean SSH. I really mean HTTPS. So we'll go ahead and hit the I in the editor here and space back. My DMZ subnet is at 192.168.80.0/24, and my internal host happens to be my NPM, which is 172.16.0.15. And what I'm doing is I'm adding an IP tables entry that specifically says to accept that traffic. So now I'll do an escape, write and quit. We have not yet invoked our script, but let's go ahead and take a look at those forwarding rules in the IP tables. And here you can see the standard forwarding rules that we would expect in order to use the zone-based firewall, and that's what the uBIOS entries mean here. At this point, we can go ahead and invoke our script by executing it with this command. And then if we do an up arrow and list the IP tables again, you'll notice that there is an entry that specifically says anything coming from the source 192.168.80.0 is now allowed to go to 172.16.0.15 as long as it is TCP port number 443. Once we head back up to Mesh Central, I can go ahead and click on the Rocket Chat client here, go over to Terminal and click Connect. And now it correctly connects to the Rocket Chat SSH session as expected. Since our zone-based firewall policy isn't really doing anything for us, we can go ahead and click on this here, scroll down to the bottom, and do a remove. And we'll go ahead and say proceed. And now all we have here, going from the source of the DMZ zone to the internal network, is we have allow return traffic, but we have block all traffic. And this would lead you to believe that we can sit on our main LAN and communicate to the DMZ, and it can communicate back to us, but not in the direction from the DMZ, meaning the Rocket Chat client, back to the Mesh Central server. But in virtue of the IP tables entry that we just made, this will still continue to work. And here we are back at Mesh Central, except this time without the zone-based firewall entry. I click on Rocket Chat, I click on Terminal, and I click on Connect, and we are not able to connect. You might wonder why we were not able to connect this time. So here I am back down at the UDM Pro command line, and if I do the listing once again with the sudo IP tables, you'll notice that our entry has gone away. And this can sometimes happen periodically because it will go refresh these entries, but I have a way to make that persistent, and that will be indicated in the show notes. But just to test this again, we'll go back and re-execute our script. And after running the script, let's go ahead and list out the IP tables entries. And once again, we have our entry for the DMZ VLAN back to the Nginx proxy manager. And now once again at Mesh Central, we go to the Rocket Chat client, we go over to the terminal, and we do a connect, and this time we're able to successfully connect. Obviously, the bottom line here is we wish that the zone-based firewall rules always worked, but unfortunately, sometimes they do not. A good workaround for this is to make those entries in the IP tables as I've shown in this tutorial, or another option is to simply not block the traffic from the VLAN back to your main LAN where you want that capability to exist. And sadly enough, it's probably not a good solution because turning off security is not really what we expect of a sophisticated firewall. So it's my hope that Ubiquiti will address fixing this issue. So in summary, the zone-based firewall is subject to certain policies being ignored because of the order of execution in the IP tables chains. And it may be that the legacy IDS and IPS is partly to blame. And hopefully Ubiquiti will be more transparent in regards to the functioning of ZBF. So if IP tables entries are needed to achieve granular control over firewall entries, then hopefully we will see those functions exposed in the GUI in future releases. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit your notification bell, and we'll see you next time.